On the limestone height above the plain, before marble temples catch the sun, and before citizens raise their hands to decide the fate of a city, Athens is only a hard place to live. The rock is old, pale and stubborn. The soil lies thin over the bones of Attica. Rain comes unevenly. Summers burn the hills to a dusty gold. In the distance, the Saronic Gulf flashes like a promise. But the sea is not yet an empire. It is a road, a danger, and a question. Long before Athens becomes the city of democracy, philosophy, drama, and restless argument, it begins as a settlement trying to survive between stone and water, between memory and hunger, between the safety of a hill and the pull of the wider world. The later Athenians will look back at this landscape and fill it with meaning. They will imagine themselves not as newcomers, but as people born from their own earth, rooted in Attica like the olive tree sacred to Athena. They will tell stories of kings whose names blur into myth, of Theseus gathering scattered villages into one political body, of gods contending for the loyalty of the city. Yet beneath the legends is something more difficult and perhaps more interesting. A real human community slowly forming in a place that gives little easily. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because Athens, for all its later brilliance, is not born from perfection. It is born from pressure. The Attic Peninsula does not offer the broad river valleys of Egypt or Mesopotamia, where grain can grow in heavy abundance. It is a land of broken hills, dry stream beds, scrub, thyme, wild grasses, and scattered patches of cultivable ground. To the north and west rise mountains that make movement inland difficult. To the south and east, the coastline folds into bays, harbours, and islands. What survives in the record suggests that the communities of Attica learned early that survival could not depend on one crop, one valley, or one ruler's storehouse. They needed goats on the slopes, barley in rougher fields, vines where the earth allowed it, olives in stony soil, pottery from local clay, and ships that could turn the sea from a boundary into a lifeline. The Acropolis itself is not yet the shining symbol that later centuries will know. In the deep past, it is a strong rock, naturally defensible, rising above the surrounding ground. People gather near it because height offers protection and visibility. From its slopes, the plain opens outward, and beyond the plain the sea waits. Archaeological traces show that the area around Athens is inhabited long before the classical age. Though the evidence is fragmentary and scholars still debate many details of early settlement, continuity, and political development, the record does not give a clean beginning. It gives pottery, graves, walls, foundations, remembered names, and later stories that may preserve faint shadows of earlier events. Athens emerges not in a single dramatic moment, but through accumulation. In the Bronze Age, when palace cultures rise elsewhere in the Aegean world, Athens belongs to a wider world of exchange, hierarchy, and danger. Mycenaean power leaves traces across Greece, and the Athenian Acropolis appears to have held a fortified centre, though it never becomes as clearly dominant in the surviving evidence as Mycenae or Pylos. Later, Athenians will cherish the idea that their city passed through the age of collapse without being erased. And there may be some truth in the sense of continuity, though the evidence remains incomplete. Around the end of the Bronze Age, many Eastern Mediterranean societies suffer disruption. Palaces burn, trade networks fracture, writing systems vanish in some regions, and populations shift. Athens does not escape change, but it seems to remain inhabited. That self-image matters because Athens will eventually build politics out of memory. The Athenians do not simply inhabit a landscape, they narrate it. A hill becomes a sacred height, a spring becomes the trace of a god, an old grave becomes proof of ancestral depth. The past is never neutral in Athens. It is a tool, a claim, and sometimes a weapon. The city's later citizens will argue in courts and assemblies about law, property, honour, empire, and justice. But behind their arguments stands this deeper idea that Athens is not just a community of the living. It is a community of ancestors, rituals, tombs, gods, and inherited obligations. The surprising thing is how much of later Athens is already hinted at by the constraints of this early world. Poor soil helps push people toward the sea. The sea encourages contact. Contact brings wealth, danger, imitation, rivalry, and stories from elsewhere. A defensible hill encourages gathering. Scattered villages encourage the long process of unification. Limited farmland creates tensions over ownership, debt, and status. Local cults and shared festivals help stitch together a territory that is not naturally easy to govern. Even before democracy has a name, the conditions that will make it possible and unstable are taking shape. The famous myth of Athena and Poseidon captures this with almost perfect symbolic economy. Poseidon offers the power of the sea, a gift of force and movement. Athena offers the olive tree, patient, productive, rooted in harsh soil and useful in many forms. The story is not evidence for an event, but myths often preserve what a culture thinks it knows about itself. The Athenians understand that their city belongs to both gifts. It cannot exist without the sea, yet it also depends on the stubborn tree that thrives where richer crops struggle. Olive oil will become food, light, medicine, perfume, trade good, and ritual substance. It is a quiet technology of survival. Around the Acropolis, life remains smaller than the later monuments make it seem. Smoke rises from hearths. Farmers move between fields and slopes. Craftspeople shape clay, metal, wood, and stone. Sailors watch weather and currents. Religious observances bind households to local gods and heroes. There are elites, dependents, labourers, women whose lives are largely hidden by later male-authored records, enslaved people whose presence becomes more visible in later centuries, and ordinary residents whose names vanish completely. No single explanation fully accounts for how these scattered human lives become the Athens of Pericles and Socrates. The transformation is too long, too layered, and too entangled with regional change. For centuries, Athens is one community among many in the Greek world, not the obvious centre of history. Other places are wealthier, stronger, more famous, or more strategically placed. Yet Attica gives Athens something unusual, a territory large enough to matter, difficult enough to demand adaptation, and connected enough to prevent isolation. Its people inherit memories of survival, a landscape of sacred meanings, and access to maritime routes that widen their horizon. Out of these elements, slowly and unevenly, a city begins to form a personality suspicious of dependence, drawn toward argument, proud of endurance, and aware that power may come not only from land, but from coordination, persuasion, and collective identity. This is where the story of Athens must begin, not with the Parthenon already gleaming, not with philosophers already walking beneath colonnades, not with citizens already voting in a mature assembly, but with the hard silence before greatness. The rocks come first. The dry hills come first. The little settlements, the ancestral graves, the the uncertain memories, the need to trade, the stubborn olive tree, the dangerous sea, these come first. From them rises a city that will one day ask how human beings should govern themselves, how truth should be tested, how beauty should be made public, and how power should be limited before it destroys the very freedom it claims to defend. The land around Athens does not flatter its inhabitants. It teaches them by refusing them comfort. Attica is not empty, not barren in a simple sense, and not incapable of supporting life. But it is rarely generous in the way a great alluvial plain can be generous. Its fertility is uneven, its valleys are narrow, its hills interrupt movement and divide small communities from one another. A farmer working this soil cannot easily imagine endless surplus. He sees stone in the fields, the thinness of earth, the need to coax grain from patches that may fail if the rains come wrongly, and from this difficulty, Athens begins to learn one of its oldest lessons. A city that cannot depend entirely on the land must learn to think beyond it. This does not mean that the Athenians abandon agriculture. They remain deeply tied to farming, seasons, harvests, and household land. Grain still matters, and barley, tougher than wheat, becomes one of the staples of the region. Figs, vines, goats, sheep, and small gardens help sustain families. But the crop that best expresses Attica is the olive. Its roots can grip poor, stony ground. Its fruit can be pressed into oil that stores travels, burns in lamps, flavors food, cleans bodies, honors gods, and enters trade. The olive tree is slow, almost stubbornly slow, but once mature it becomes a form of wealth that belongs perfectly to a difficult landscape. Later, Athenians may surround the olive with sacred meaning, but before symbolism there is practical intelligence. The tree survives where other hopes are weaker. From the slopes and fields, the eye is always drawn outward. The sea lies close enough to shape imagination. Attica is not an island, but it feels half maritime by nature, with coastlines opening toward the Cyclades, Euboea, the Peloponnese, Asia Minor, Egypt, and the wider eastern Mediterranean. For communities living near Athens, the sea offers fish, salt, travel, trade, and escape from the limits of local production. It also offers pirates, storms, enemy fleets, and the possibility that fortune can vanish beyond the horizon. Scholars still debate many details of early Athenian maritime development, but what survives in the record suggests a people increasingly drawn into networks larger than Attica itself. The sea becomes a second landscape, more dangerous than the fields but also more flexible. This outward pull helps explain why Athens eventually becomes such a restless city. It is not only because Athenians are unusually curious or argumentative by temperament, though later writers will often make them seem that way. Geography trains them in comparison. Ships bring grain, timber, metal, pottery styles, stories, gods, coinage, techniques, and rumours of distant wars. A port does not merely move goods, it moves assumptions. The person who sees foreign merchants unloading cargo cannot believe quite so easily that the local way is the only way. Even before Athens becomes famous for philosophical debate, its people live in a world that repeatedly introduces alternatives. Other customs exist. Other laws exist. Other cities rise, fall, borrow, and compete. Yet in early Athens, the great port of Piraeus is not immediately the fully developed naval machine it will become in the 5th century BCE. That transformation comes later, especially with the rise of Athenian sea power. But the coastal orientation of Attica is already important. Small harbours, landing places, and maritime routes matter long before monumental shipsheds and trireme fleets. The Athenian future waits in this relationship between the inland city and the coast. The Acropolis and the Agora will become the symbolic and civic heart, but the sea will become the artery through which food, wealth, and empire flow. Athens has to become more than a hill town because its own environment keeps pushing it outward. The mountains contribute in a different way. They limit easy expansion, but they also hold resources. The most important of these, though it will matter most dramatically later, is silver from the mines of Laurion in southeastern Attica. Silver is not just shiny metal. In the ancient world, it is potential power coinage, wages, public projects, military preparation, political leverage. When Athens later uses silver revenues to build ships, the city's rocky land will have given it not grain abundance, but a different kind of future. A lesser-known detail is that mining landscapes are not simply economic zones. They are harsh, technical, and socially revealing places. They require labour, expertise, organisation, and control. They also expose the darker foundations of ancient prosperity, because much of this labour in later Athens is performed by enslaved people under dangerous conditions. The brilliance of the city always has shadows beneath it. Clay, too, matters. The region around Athens produces excellent material for pottery, and Athenian ceramics will eventually travel widely across the Mediterranean. Long before museums place painted vases behind glass, they are objects of use, exchange, storage, dining, ritual, and display. They carry oil and wine, they mark graves, they depict gods, athletes, revellers, warriors, myths, and everyday gestures. In pottery, Athens learns another form of outward speech. Its craftspeople create things that leave the city and return to it in reputation. The evidence remains incomplete for every stage of this development, but the long importance of ceramic production shows how geography, craft, and commerce can build influence before political dominance arrives. Attica's broken landscape also shapes the problem of unity. A broad plain can encourage central control through agriculture and irrigation, but Attica is more scattered. Villages, coastal settlements, inland farms, noble estates, and sacred sites form a patchwork. Later, Athenians remember the unification of Attica through the figure of Theseus, whose legendary Sinuocism gathers many communities into one city. The myth may not preserve a simple historical event, but it points toward a real political achievement, the gradual creation of a shared Athenian identity over a varied territory. To become Athens, Attica has to become imaginable as one civic body. That is not automatic. It requires rituals, roads, stories, legal habits, military obligations, and institutions capable of making distant households feel bound to the same public fate. This need for integration becomes one of the deep roots of later democracy. The city cannot simply ignore its countryside. Citizens will come from dems spread across Attica, from inland farms, coastal zones, and urban neighbourhoods. The political system that eventually develops will make geography part of civic identity. The land that once divides people will later be reorganized into tribes, districts, and mechanisms of representation. No single explanation fully accounts for the emergence of Athenian democracy, but the physical structure of Attica helps make the later solution intelligible. Athens has to solve the problem of belonging across space. At the same time, the land teaches insecurity. A poor harvest is not abstract. A shortage of grain can become debt. Debt can become dependency. Dependency can become anger. A city that imports food is never entirely self-sufficient. A city that relies on trade must care about sea lanes, alliances, ships, and coin. A city whose elite families control the best land must confront resentment from those who do not. The geography that encourages ingenuity also produces conflict. Athens is forced to become clever, but cleverness does not make society just. So the early character of Athens grows from contradiction. It is rooted and mobile, rural and maritime, sacred and commercial, poor in some resources yet rich in possibilities. The hills make it defensive, the sea makes it open, the soil makes it practical, the mines make it ambitious, the olive makes it patient, trade makes it alert. Out of these pressures comes a society that will one day turn necessity into identity. Athenians will praise themselves as free, inventive, and unusually attached to public life. But behind that self-image lies a harsher truth. The city becomes influential not because its land gives it everything, but because its land denies it enough to force imagination. As Athens grows out of its hard landscape, the city does not immediately become a place where ordinary citizens shape their own destiny. That image belongs to a later age, and even then it will be incomplete. Early Athens is a society of rank, family prestige, inherited land, sacred privilege, and legal memory held by powerful men. The same geography that has forced ingenuity also sharpens inequality. Some households own better fields, stronger networks, older names, and the authority that comes from claiming descent from heroic ancestors. Others work small plots that may not feed them through a bad year. Between them lies the slow danger that has troubled farming societies for thousands of years: debt, dependence, and the fear that private hardship can become public collapse. The old Athenian elite are often remembered under the broad name of the Eupatrids, the well-born. The term itself carries the weight of ancestry, as if political authority is not merely possessed but inherited through blood and memory. These aristocratic families dominate offices, religious roles, legal knowledge, and the informal power that comes from being able to call on allies. Early Athens does not yet have the thick democratic machinery of assembly pay, citizen juries, regular accountability, and broad participation. Instead, authority is concentrated in magistrates such as archons, and in the council associated with the Areopagus, a body tied to former office holders and aristocratic prestige. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact shape of these early institutions, but the pattern is clear enough. Athens is not born democratic. It has to struggle its way there. In this world, law is not yet fully public in the later sense. Custom, family standing, and the judgment of elite officials carry enormous force. A poor man who does not know the law cannot influence the magistrate, and lacks powerful kin stands at a disadvantage before the dispute even begins. This is one reason the later memory of Draco matters. Around the late 7th century BCE, Athenians associate Draco with the first written law code of the city. Later tradition will make his laws famous for their severity, so severe that the word draconian survives long after Athens itself has lost political independence. But the deeper significance is not simply harsh punishment. Written law, even harsh written law, changes the nature of power. When rules are displayed, or at least fixed in a more public form, aristocrats lose some of their ability to treat justice as private knowledge. Yet written law does not solve the deeper crisis. A code can define penalties without healing the society that needs them. Beneath the surface, Attica is under strain. Farmers borrow in order to survive. Loans may be secured against land, labour, or even personal freedom. Some Athenians become dependent workers on land they may once have held more securely. Later sources describe a class sometimes called hectemeroi, often interpreted as sharecroppers who owe a portion of their produce, perhaps a sixth, to creditors or landlords, though the exact nature of their status remains debated. What matters for the story is the social memory of humiliation markers on land, obligations that cling to households, and the terrifying possibility that debt can strip a person of autonomy. One of the most haunting traces of this world is the idea of boundary stones, horoi, set into the earth to mark encumbered property. A field is not only a field, it becomes a visible record of obligation. Anyone passing by can see that this land is tied to debt. In later Athenian memory, the removal of such stone will become a powerful symbol of liberation. But before that release, there is the quiet pressure of shame and anxiety. Imagine the farmer looking across the same rough soil his family has worked for years and seeing not security, but a claim against him. The earth that once promised continuity now carries a warning. Debt in an agrarian society is rarely just economic. It becomes moral, political, and psychological. The creditor may describe the debt as lawful. The debtor may experience it as a trap. The aristocrat may see order. The farmer may see a city being divided into masters and dependents. The city's gods may receive sacrifices. Festivals may continue, and noble families may compete for honor. But under this visible order, the civic body is thinning. No single explanation fully accounts for Athens' later transformation. But this pressure from below is essential. Democracy does not arise because Athens is naturally fair. It emerges in part because unfairness threatens to tear the community apart. At the top of society, rivalry is also dangerous. Aristocratic politics is not calm rule by a united class. Great families compete for office, followers, marriages, prestige, and sacred legitimacy. Personal ambition can become factional conflict. A striking early sign of instability appears in the attempted seizure of power by Solon, traditionally placed in the 7th century BCE. Solon is an aristocrat and Olympic victor, exactly the sort of man whose fame can be converted into political ambition. His attempt fails, and later memory turns the event into a religious and political stain, associated with the killing of his supporters after they seek sanctuary. The details are difficult, layered by later storytelling and political use, but the episode reveals a city where elite competition can push Athens toward crisis. This is important because Athens' path to democracy is not a simple uprising of common people against nobles. It is messier. The elite themselves are divided. Some aristocrats may seek popular support against rivals. Some may favor reform to prevent revolution. Others may defend inherited privilege. Ordinary farmers may demand relief without necessarily imagining a fully democratic future. Craftsmen, traders, and emerging wealth outside the oldest noble families complicate the picture further. Athens is changing economically and socially, but its political structure lags behind the change. The result is tension, and tension is one of the true engines of Athenian history. The wider Greek world is also experimenting. Across the Archaic period, many polis face conflicts between aristocrats, rising non-aristocratic wealth, indebted farmers, hoplite soldiers, and ambitious strongmen. Some cities fall under tyrants. Some develop broader institutions. Some remain oligarchic. Athens is unusual not because it alone faces crisis, but because its crisis eventually produces one of the most radical political experiments of the ancient world. At this stage, however, that outcome is not obvious. A reasonable observer might expect Athens to become just another aristocratic state, or to fall under a lasting tyranny, or to dissolve into repeated factional struggle. Daily life carries these political tensions in ordinary forms. In the countryside, the seasons continue. Men work land and attend local cults. Women manage households, textile production, religious obligations, and family continuity. Though the surviving public record preserves their voices only faintly, craftspeople produce goods that connect Athens to exchange networks. The city's sacred calendar gathers people into shared rituals even as economic divisions deepen. At festivals, the community can appear united before the gods. In fields and courts, it may feel dangerously unequal. That contrast between public unity and private distress will haunt Athens again and again, even in its most famous democratic years. By the early 6th century BCE, the pressure is reaching a point where old habits cannot easily continue. The aristocrats have prestige, offices, and land, but prestige alone cannot make a divided society stable. The poor have grievances, but grievance alone cannot create a new political order. Written law exists, but law without balance may simply preserve the power of those already strong. Athens stands at one of those moments when a city becomes aware that its traditions are not enough. The rocky land has taught endurance. The sea has opened horizons, and the old families have built a hierarchy that seems ancient and natural. But beneath that hierarchy, debt is turning citizens against citizens. The city that will one day speak of freedom first has to confront the possibility that many of its own people are not free in any meaningful sense. By the time Solon enters the story, Athens has become a city suspended between old authority and possible rupture. The aristocrats still hold prestige, offices, and religious weight, but the poorer citizens carry anger that can no longer be treated as a private inconvenience. Debt has eaten into the countryside. Land has been marked by obligations. Some Athenians have fallen into dependency so severe that the line between citizen and servant begins to blur. Others have left Attica under the pressure of debt, or fear they may lose the freedom that makes them members of the community at all. The city does not yet know that it is moving toward democracy, but it does know that something must give. Solon is remembered as the man asked to stand in the dangerous middle. He is not a revolutionary in the modern sense, and he is not a simple champion of the poor. He is an aristocrat, a poet, a lawgiver, and a political mediator, chosen because both sides seem to believe, or at least hope, that he will not destroy them. That position makes him powerful, but it also makes him vulnerable to disappointment from every direction. The wealthy fear confiscation. The poor expect relief. Factional leaders watch for advantage. What survives in the record suggests that Solon's greatness lies not in satisfying Athens, but in preventing Athens from breaking. His most famous act is the Sisachteia, often translated as the shaking off of burdens. The phrase itself has a physical force to it, as if the land and the people have been carrying something heavy across their backs. Solon cancels debts secured on the person, forbids the enslavement of Athenians for debt, and is remembered as removing the horoi, the boundary stones that marked encumbered land. The image is powerful stones pulled from the fields, obligations erased from the earth, the visible signs of humiliation lifted away. Later generations will turn this into a foundational moment of freedom. Yet scholars still debate many details, including the exact legal mechanisms, the status of those affected, and the full economic reach of the reform. The evidence remains incomplete, and later sources look back through the haze of political memory. Still, the broad meaning is clear. Solon draws a line. An Athenian citizen should not be reduced by debt into a condition that destroys his civic standing. This is not the same as economic equality. Solon does not redistribute land in the radical way some poor Athenians may have wanted. He does not erase aristocratic influence. He does not create democracy in its later 5th century form. He is trying to rescue the city from civil conflict without overturning the entire social order. That compromise is precisely why his reforms are so important and so unsatisfying. The poor receive freedom from the most crushing form of debt bondage, but not a new world of equal property. The wealthy keep much of their land and status, but lose a form of control that had made their power dangerous. Solon's Athens becomes freer, but not fair in any simple sense. His political reforms are equally revealing. Solon reorganizes civic participation around property classes, not noble birth alone. The wealthier citizens remain eligible for the highest offices, but political identity begins to shift from pure aristocratic lineage toward measured economic capacity. The classes later known as Pentakosiomedium Noi, Hippes, Zeugitai, and Thetes reflect gradations of wealth and military function. The system is still hierarchical. A poor labourer does not suddenly stand equal to an elite landowner in access to office. Yet something has changed. The door of public life is no longer guarded only by the oldest families. Wealth, production, and service to the city begin to matter alongside ancestry. This is not democracy yet, but it weakens the idea that blood alone should command the polis. Solon also gives ordinary citizens a more meaningful relationship to justice. Later Athenians associate him with the right of appeal to a popular court, allowing citizens to challenge decisions of magistrates. The exact early form of this institution is debated, but its symbolic importance is immense. If a magistrate's judgment can be reviewed, then office holding is not absolute. If citizens can participate in judgment, then law begins to belong to the community rather than only to officials. A lesser-known but significant feature of Solon's legal reforms is the widening of public concern in some traditions. Even a person not directly injured can bring a case on behalf of someone wronged. Whether every detail is recoverable or not, the principle points toward a city in which injustice is not merely a private matter between households. It can become a civic issue. This matters because Athens is slowly inventing the habit of public accountability. The later democracy will depend not only on voting, but on scrutiny, courts, audits, accusations, speeches, procedures, and the expectation that power must answer to the citizen body. Solon does not complete that invention, but he helps make it imaginable. He places law, status, debt, and office within a broader civic framework. He takes problems that might have produced vengeance and attempts to translate them into institutions. That is one of the quieter miracles of political history, and also one of its most fragile. Institutions do not remove ambition or resentment. They only give a city a chance to survive them. The cultural memory of Solon is shaped by his poetry, or by verses attributed to him, in which he presents himself as a man standing with a shield between hostile forces. He claims not to have allowed either side to triumph completely. There is a hard honesty in that image. Solon does not describe a city healed into harmony. He describes a city restrained from self-destruction. He knows that compromise can look like betrayal to those who suffer, and weakness to those who rule. His laws are therefore not the end of conflict, but a pause in which Athens can breathe. After establishing his reforms, Solon is said to leave Athens for a period. Partly so the city cannot pressure him to change the laws immediately. The story may be shaped by later moral tradition, but it captures a real political truth. A lawgiver who remains too close to the anger of the moment may be swallowed by it. By stepping away, Solon becomes less a factional leader than a figure of memory, a man whose work can be argued over after he is gone. And Athenians will argue over him for centuries. Conservatives, democrats, oligarchs, and philosophers will all try to claim the meaning of Solon. That alone shows how central his reforms become to the city's self-understanding. Yet the fragility of the reset is visible almost immediately. The old tensions do not vanish. Aristocratic rivalries continue. Regional factions form around the plain, the coast, and the hills. Poor citizens may be freer from debt bondage, but many remain economically vulnerable. Elite families still compete for influence. The city has been saved from one crisis, only to discover that reform can create new expectations. Once people have seen that laws can be changed, that burdens can be lifted, that inherited power can be checked, it becomes harder to convince them that the old order is sacred and immovable. This is the paradox of Solon's achievement. By preventing revolution, he makes deeper transformation possible. By refusing full equality, he leaves grievances alive. By limiting aristocratic power, he opens the imagination of citizenship. By preserving hierarchy, he ensures that future struggles will continue. Athens, after Solon, is neither aristocratic in the old way nor democratic in the later sense. It is a city in transition, and transition is rarely peaceful for long. The stones may have been pulled from the fields, but the memory of having needed them remains. The citizens may have escaped the worst grip of debt, but they have also learned that public pressure can force public change. Out of that lesson, Athens takes another step toward the dangerous brilliance that will one day make it famous. By the time the old tensions return after Solon, Athens has learned something dangerous about itself. The city can be changed, laws can be rewritten, burdens can be lifted, the authority of ancient families can be challenged without the sky falling. But Solon's compromise has not produced calm. It has left a political field full of wounded pride, unmet expectations, and rival aristocrats searching for a way to turn public frustration into private power. Reform has saved Athens from one kind of collapse, yet it has also exposed the weakness of the old order. Into that unsettled space comes a figure who seems to belong to the familiar world of ambitious nobles, but who understands that power in Athens can no longer rest only on ancestry. Pisistratus is remembered as a tyrant, but the ancient Greek word does not mean exactly what the modern ear expects. A tyrant is not necessarily a mad despot ruling only through terror. In archaic Greece, a tyrant is often a man who seizes power outside the traditional constitutional order, usually by exploiting factional conflict, popular support, military force, or all three at once. His rule is illegitimate in procedure, even when it may be effective in practice. This distinction matters because Pisistratus does not enter Athenian memory simply as a monster. Later, Athenians, even those deeply committed to democracy, could look back on his rule with uneasy recognition. He limits elite rivals, supports cult and festival life, encourages economic activity, and helps make Athens feel more like a single city. The city after Solon appears divided by regional and social interests. Later sources speak of factions associated with the plain, the coast, and the hills, though scholars still debate how literally to take these categories and how much they reflect later simplification. What they preserve is the image of a divided Attica wealthy landholders, coastal interests, poorer upland communities, and aristocratic leaders competing for followings. Pisistratus presents himself as the champion of those beyond the strongest elite circles, especially the poorer people of the hills. Whether this support was as broad as later accounts suggest remains uncertain, but the political tactic is clear. He does not merely fight aristocrats as another aristocrat. He makes himself appear useful to those who feel overlooked. The stories of his seizure of power are dramatic, almost theatrical, and for that reason must be handled carefully. Ancient accounts describe staged injuries, bodyguards granted by the people, exile, return, and even a strange procession in which a tall woman dressed as Athena supposedly escorts him back into the city. These details may contain exaggeration, comedy, hostile memory, or political folklore. Yet their theatricality reveals something true about archaic politics. Power must be performed, the gods must appear to approve, the people must be persuaded, not only coerced. Athens is already a place where appearance, ritual, and public belief matter. Pisistratus understands that ruling the city means ruling its imagination. Once secure, he does not dismantle Solon's laws. That is one of the most surprising features of his tyranny. He governs through, around, and above existing institutions rather than simply erasing them. Magistracies continue, laws continue, the city's public forms remain visible, but real power is concentrated in his hands and in the network of his supporters. This gives the tyranny a stabilizing surface. It can claim continuity while redirecting authority. It can calm some conflicts because one powerful man now stands above rival families. For Athenians exhausted by factional struggle, that may not have seemed like the worst possible outcome. The evidence remains incomplete, and we cannot recover the private feelings of most citizens. But the endurance of his regime suggests that tyranny could offer a kind of order democracy had not yet learned to provide. Pisistratus also grasped that a city is built not only by laws, but by shared experiences. Festivals become crucial. The Panathenaia, the great festival of Athena, grows in importance as a civic event binding Attica to the city and the city to its patron goddess. Athletic contests, processions, sacrifices, music, and public display turn religious devotion into political unity. The cult of Dionysus also gains prominence, and from that world of ritual performance, Athens will eventually develop the dramatic culture that produces tragedy and comedy. It would be too simple to say Pisistratus invents Athenian theatre, but the tyrannical period helps create conditions in which public festival, performance, and civic identity reinforce one another. A city that gathers to watch, judge, remember, and feel together is learning habits that later democracy will use in different ways. Building projects matter for the same reason. Public works make power visible. Roads, fountains, sanctuaries, and improvements to the urban centre are not merely practical additions, they change how people experience Athens. A fountain house can alter daily movement and public gathering. A sanctuary can focus devotion. A road can make procession and administration easier. A more coherent urban space can teach people to imagine themselves as members of a larger civic whole, rather than only as residents of scattered local communities. The later brilliance of the Acropolis and Agora should not make us overlook these earlier acts of consolidation. Athens is being prepared, stone by stone and ritual by ritual, for a future in which public space becomes political space. There is also an economic dimension. Pisistratus is associated with policies that support small farmers, rural justice, and the production of olive oil, though the exact details are difficult to reconstruct. Later tradition suggests travelling judges or local judicial access, which would fit the broader pattern of drawing rural Attica more tightly into the orbit of the central city. Whether every measure attributed to him is historical or not, the direction is plausible. A ruler who wants to weaken aristocratic rivals must reduce the dependence of ordinary people on local elites. If a farmer can appeal beyond the nearest noble household, if festivals and markets connect him to the city, if roads and cults tie his dem to Athens, then the political map of Attica begins to shift. The tyranny is therefore both a blockage and a bridge. It blocks the immediate development of citizen self-rule by placing authority in the hands of one family, but it also weakens the older aristocratic monopoly, strengthens central institutions, expands civic identity, and helps create a shared Athenian culture. This is one of the ironies of early Athens democracy will partly inherit the work of tyranny. The later citizens who pride themselves on freedom will walk through a city shaped by men who ruled without democratic consent. History rarely gives clean origins. After Pisistratus dies, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus continue the regime. At first, the tyranny appears stable, but dynastic rule is more fragile than personal authority. The murder of Hipparchus by Harmodius and Aristogeiton later becomes one of the most famous political memories in Athens, celebrated as an act against tyranny. Yet the historical event is more complicated than the democratic legend that grows around it. Personal motives, elite rivalries, and later propaganda blur together. What matters is that after the killing, Hippias rules more harshly, and the regime loses the softer legitimacy Pisistratus had cultivated. Fear begins to replace balance. When Hippias is finally expelled, Athens does not simply return to the old aristocratic order. Too much has changed. Attica has been drawn closer together. Public festivals have grown stronger. The city centre has become more important. Aristocratic families remain powerful, but they operate in a transformed civic landscape. Ordinary Athenians have experienced both the relief of Solon's reforms and the centralizing force of tyranny. They have seen that power can bypass old noble structures, that the city can be imagined as a whole, and that public life can be staged on a larger scale than before. The fall of the tyrants leaves a vacuum, but not an empty city. It leaves a more integrated Athens, waiting for the next political invention. The fall of Hippias does not leave Athens free in any simple, shining sense. It leaves the city exposed. The tyrant is gone. But the question beneath the tyranny remains unresolved: who now belongs to Athens? Who has the right to guide it? And how can a territory of villages, noble houses, farmers, craftsmen, shrines, memories, and rival interests become one political body without falling back into domination by a few powerful families? The old aristocrats are still there. Their names still matter. Their marriages, alliances, religious claims, and inherited prestige still shape public life. The people have helped push tyranny aside, but they do not yet possess a stable system that can keep elite ambition from returning in another form. Athens stands in the dangerous silence after liberation, when the enemy has been removed but the future has not yet been built. The struggle that follows is not a clean contest between democracy and oligarchy, as later language might make it seem. It is a fight among aristocrats in a city where the people are becoming impossible to ignore. Cleisthenes, a member of the powerful Alcmaeonid family, competes with Isagoras, another elite figure with his own supporters. At first, this looks like the old pattern noble rivals battling for influence while ordinary citizens watch from below. But Athens has already changed too much for that older pattern to contain it. Solon has weakened the most brutal forms of dependency. Pisistrates has centralized civic life and made the city feel more unified. Festivals, roads, cults, and shared institutions have drawn Attica closer together. The demos, the people, is no longer merely a background force. It is becoming a political reality. When Agora gains advantage and calls in Spartan support, Athens comes close to losing control of its own future. Cleisthenes and his allies are pushed out. The Spartan king Cleomenes enters the city, and an attempt is made to reshape Athenian politics under narrower control. But the response is extraordinary. The Athenians resist. The Acropolis, that old defensive height from the earliest layers of the city's story, becomes again a place where power is contested. The people do not simply accept the arrangement imposed upon them. The details in later sources are compressed and politically charged, and scholars still debate the exact sequence of events. But the meaning is difficult to miss. Athens is no longer a passive prize to be handed between elite factions. A broader citizen body is beginning to act as if the city belongs to it. Cleisthenes returns, and with him comes one of the most radical acts of political imagination in ancient history. He does not merely promise to be a better aristocrat. He changes the structure through which Athenians identify themselves. The old power of kinship clan and local aristocratic influence cannot be destroyed by speeches alone. It has to be cut across. So Cleisthenes reorganizes the citizen body into 10 new tribes, not based on ancient noble descent, but built from demes and regional groupings that deliberately mix different parts of Attica. The territory is divided into areas associated with the city, the coast, and the inland regions, and these are combined into new tribal units. Geography itself becomes a political instrument. This may sound administrative, almost dry, but it is one of the decisive turns in the Athenian story. A man who once primarily belongs to a local village, a noble patronage network, or an inherited clan identity is now inserted into a broader civic design. His dem becomes part of his official identity. His tribe connects him with people from other parts of Attica. The city forces citizens to imagine political kinship beyond blood. It does not erase family, wealth, status, or local loyalties, but it places another identity over them, Athenian citizenship organized through a new public map. In a world where noble families often preserve power by controlling older social bonds, Cleisthenes attacks the foundations of influence by rearranging belonging itself. The dem is especially important. It is not just a place on a map. It becomes the basic unit through which citizens are registered, identified, and connected to the wider polis. Athenian names increasingly include the dem, tying personal identity to civic geography rather than only to family lineage. This is a subtle but profound change. The citizen is not merely the son of an old house. He is a member of a registered community inside the political structure of Athens. What survives in the record suggests that this dame system becomes one of the great anchors of Athenian public life, giving the democracy a local foundation that can survive far beyond the crisis that produced it. Cleisthenes also creates, or at least gives new form to, the Council of 500. Each of the 10 tribes supplies 50 members, helping prepare business for the assembly and giving the political system a broader working machinery. This council does not make Athens a modern representative democracy, and it should not be mistaken for one. The assembly of citizens will remain central, but the council matters because a large citizen body cannot function by pure impulse alone. It needs agenda, procedure, rotation, and organization. The reforms begin to divide power across institutions in a way that makes domination by one narrow group harder. No single office, family, or faction can easily claim the whole city without confronting structures designed to distribute participation. There is also a military logic hidden inside the political reform. The 10 tribes become units of civic and military organization. Men who might once have felt primarily tied to local or aristocratic networks now serve and act through new tribal structures. Politics, war, ritual, and identity reinforce one another. Athens is learning that a citizen body is not made only by laws. It is made by repeated participation, shared risk, public rituals, and the experience of standing beside people whom older society would not necessarily have grouped together. Democracy, in this sense, is not only an idea, it is a habit built into bodies, routes, names, offices, calendars, and military roles. Cleisthenes is also associated with ostracism, the famous procedure by which citizens could vote to exile a man considered dangerously powerful for 10 years without confiscating his property or condemning him as a criminal. Whether the practice begins immediately under Cleisthenes or is implemented slightly later remains debated, but its spirit fits the anxiety of the age. Athens has known tyranny. It has seen elite ambition nearly return under foreign-backed pressure. Ostracism is a strange and revealing invention, a legal safety valve for political fear. It admits that a citizen can become too powerful even before he has committed a prosecutable crime. It is not gentle, and it can be used politically, but it shows the city's determination to prevent one man from standing above the whole. Still, the new order has limits that must remain visible. Women do not participate as citizens in the assembly. Enslaved people are excluded entirely from political freedom, even though their labour will support much of the city's economy. Resident foreigners, or metics, may contribute to commerce, craft, and cultural life without holding citizen rights. Even among male citizens, wealth and status continue to matter. The reforms do not create equality in the broad modern sense. They create a more active, more integrated, more politically empowered citizen body inside a society still marked by exclusion and hierarchy. That contradiction will never disappear from Athens. It is one of the reasons the city remains both inspiring and uncomfortable. Yet something irreversible has happened. Cleisthenes has taken the scattered inheritance of Attica and turned it into a political architecture. The hard land, the villages, the coastal roads, the inland farms, the city neighbourhoods, the noble rivalries, the memory of tyranny, and the pressure of the demos have all been rearranged into a new form. Athens is no longer merely a place ruled by aristocrats who occasionally negotiate with the people. It is becoming a citizen system, still fragile, still incomplete, but alive with a dangerous new principle. The city can be deliberately redesigned so that power answers not only to birth, but to the organized body of citizens. The old map of influence has been broken, and in its place Athens draws a map of belonging. Once Cleisthenes redraws the political body of Athens, the city begins to sound different. Power is no longer imagined only in the quiet rooms of noble houses, in hereditary claims, or in the authority of a few magistrates who stand above ordinary men. It begins to gather in open space, in procedure, in speeches, in raised hands, in the slow discipline of citizens learning that public decisions are not distant commands, but acts in which they themselves may take part. The transformation is not immediate, and it is not tidy. Democracy in Athens does not arrive as a complete machine. It grows through argument, crisis, adjustment, and repeated use. But after Cleisthenes, the essential shape is visible. The city is learning to govern itself by making citizens present. The assembly becomes the most dramatic expression of this change. Male citizens gather to hear proposals, debate war and peace, vote on laws, judge alliances, consider finances, honour benefactors, and decide matters that could alter the life of the entire polis. Later, the regular meeting place will be the Pnyx, a sloping hill west of the Acropolis, where the citizens face not a palace but one another, the city and the horizon of Attica. It is easy to romanticize this scene, and many have done so, but it's stranger and more human than a simple image of freedom. The assembly is noisy, physical, exposed to weather, emotion, persuasion, boredom, ambition, and fear. A citizen who votes is not merely expressing an opinion, he's binding himself and others to consequence. This is one of the radical features of Athens. Decisions are not hidden behind a royal curtain. They are public performances of judgment. A speaker rises, but he cannot simply command. He must persuade. Words become instruments of power, and that makes Athens different from societies where authority flows mainly from kingship or priestly hierarchy. The ability to speak well, frame danger, invoke memory, accuse rivals, or offer hope becomes politically decisive. That is exhilarating, but also dangerous. Democracy gives voice to citizens, and in doing so it gives enormous power to those who can shape the emotions of a crowd. The Athenians know this, though they never fully solve it. Scholars still debate how far ordinary citizens guided policy independently, and how far they were influenced by elite speakers. But the tension itself is central. A democracy of speech is always vulnerable to speech. Behind the assembly stands the Council of 500, the quieter machinery that helps the system function. Chosen by lot from the tribes, its members prepare business, receive envoys, supervise certain public matters, and keep civic life from dissolving into pure improvisation. The use of the lot is one of the most surprising and revealing details of Athenian democracy. Modern political cultures often associate election with democracy, but many Athenians see election as risky because elections tend to favour the rich, famous, and well-connected. Sortition, selection by lot, expresses a different democratic instinct many citizens should be capable of serving, and office should circulate rather than become the possession of a political class. This does not mean every office is chosen by lot, nor does it erase inequality, but it shows a deep suspicion of permanent power. The council's year is divided among the 10 tribes, each serving in rotation as the presiding group for a portion of the year. This rotation brings citizens from different parts of Attica into the daily rhythm of government. Men from inland demes, coastal communities, and urban neighbourhoods must spend time near the centre, handling public duties, hearing information, and feeling the weight of administration. Democracy is therefore not only the dramatic moment of voting in the assembly, it is also the repetitive labour of keeping the city going. Public freedom depends on paperwork, schedules, sacrifices, seals, records, treasuries, messengers, and men willing to leave private business for civic responsibility. The courts deepen this transformation. In Athens, justice becomes one of the main arenas of citizen power. Large juries of citizens hear cases, and legal conflict becomes another form of public life. Athenian courts are not modern courts with professional judges guiding every legal detail. They are civic spaces where litigants speak, citizens judge, and law, reputation, politics, and emotion can mix intensely. This can look chaotic, but it also means that judgment is not monopolized by a narrow legal caste. The people do not merely vote on policy, they help decide disputes, scrutinize officials, and hold power answerable. Accountability becomes a habit. Magistrates can be examined before entering office and reviewed after leaving it. Public money must be accounted for. Generals, envoys, treasurers, and officials live under the possibility of scrutiny. The system is not pure or incorruptible. No human system is. Accusations can be political. Popular anger can be harsh. Wealthy men can still use influence and rhetoric. But Athens develops an unusually dense culture of public answerability. Power is divided, watched, challenged, and made temporary. This is one of the reasons the democracy lasts as long as it does despite war, plague, empire, and internal crisis. Its strength is not that it trusts leaders completely. Its strength is that it expects leaders to be dangerous. The Agora becomes the physical heart of this world. It is marketplace, meeting ground, administrative centre, sacred landscape, memory field, and civic theatre. Merchants sell goods, citizens encounter notices and monuments, officials conduct business. Legal, commercial, and religious life overlap. The Agora is not a quiet marble museum in its own time. It is crowded, dusty, practical, and alive. Animals are led through: potters, metalworkers, money changers, philosophers, farmers, foreigners, and politicians pass through the same public zone. A lesser known but important detail is that democracy leaves material traces not only in great buildings, but in small objects inscribed decrees, jury tokens, ostraca used in ostracism, allotment devices, boundary stones, and fragments of public record. The city writes its politics into stone, bronze, clay, and procedure. Yet every description of Athenian democracy must hold its exclusions in view. The citizen body is powerful, but narrow. Women born into citizen families are essential to household continuity, religion, and legitimate descent, yet they do not speak or vote in the assembly. Enslaved people perform labour across households, workshops, mines, and public functions, but they remain outside the freedom that citizens praise. Metics, resident foreigners, may be skilled, wealthy, influential in commerce, and culturally important, but they do not possess full political rights. Athenian freedom is real for those who hold it, and limited by those it leaves out. No single explanation fully accounts for the brilliance and contradiction of this society, because both are woven together. The Athenians themselves often define freedom against tyranny. To be free is not to live under one man's arbitrary will. It is to take part in common decision, to speak in public, to be equal before certain laws as a citizen, and to know that office holders can be challenged. But freedom also means the freedom of the citizen body to rule others, including allies and subject communities once Athens becomes an empire. That darker turn lies ahead, but the seed is already present. A people proud of self-government can still deny self-government to others. Athens will become one of history's great teachers, partly because it refuses to let admiration remain simple. For now, the city's voice is rising. The reforms have created institutions, but daily practice gives them life. Citizens learn when to gather, how to listen, how to shout, how to accuse, how to vote, how to serve, how to fear powerful men, and how to imagine themselves as the city. Athens is still fragile, still surrounded by rivals, still full of inequality and ambition. But something extraordinary has entered the world, a community in which ordinary citizens, within severe limits, begin to believe that public power can belong to them. The stones of the Agora, the slope of the Nix, and the reorganized dems of Attica are becoming parts of one experiment. Democracy has not yet reached its height, but it has found its voice. The voice of Athenian democracy is still young when the eastern horizon begins to darken. For generations, Athens has struggled mostly with itself aristocrats and farmers, debt and law, tyrants and reformers, old clans and new tribes, the hard work of turning Attica into a citizen body. But no city lives only inside its own story. Beyond the Aegean, the Persian Empire has grown into the largest power the Greek world has ever faced, a vast imperial system stretching across lands, languages, armies, tribute networks, royal roads, and old kingdoms absorbed under the authority of the great king. Athens, still learning how to be free in its own unstable way, now finds itself drawn into a conflict with a monarchy on a scale almost beyond the imagination of the polis. The immediate path to confrontation runs through Ionia, the Greek cities on the coast of Asia Minor. These communities are Greek in language and culture, but many live under Persian overlordship. When revolt breaks out there in the early 5th century BCE, Athens and Eretria send aid. The assistance is limited, but symbolically explosive. From the Persian point of view, 2 small mainland Greek cities have interfered in imperial territory and helped burn Sardis, an important regional centre. The evidence for motives, scale, and intention remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how far Athens understood the consequences of its action. What matters is that the Persian court does not forget. In the world of empire, a small insult can become a reason for punishment. For Athens, the Persian threat arrives at a vulnerable and revealing moment. The democracy is new enough that its enemies might expect it to be unstable. Hippias, the expelled tyrant, still lives in exile and hopes to return under Persian protection. This is one of the most striking details of the crisis. Athens does not face Persia only as a foreign invader. It faces the possibility that external force may restore an internal past the city has just escaped. The war is therefore not only about land or tribute. It is about whether the political experiment born from Cleisthenes can survive its first encounter with imperial power. In 490 BCE, the Persian expedition crosses the Aegean, punishes Eretria, and lands at Marathon on the northeastern coast of Attica. The place matters. Marathon is not at the gates of the city, but it is within Athenian territory. The invasion is no longer rumour. It has touched the soil of Attica itself. The Athenians march out, joined by the Plataeans, whose loyalty will be remembered with unusual warmth. Sparta, asked for help, is delayed by religious timing according to later tradition. Though the exact details remain debated, Athens, for the moment, must act without the full force of Greece behind it. The Battle of Marathon becomes one of the great memories of the ancient world, and like all great memories, it is layered with later meaning. The Athenians are outmatched in imperial scale, but not helpless. They fight as hoplites, heavily armed infantry in close formation, relying on discipline, armour, shields, spears, and the cohesion of men who stand shoulder to shoulder. Later storytelling will emphasize the stunning courage of a free citizen army defeating the servants of a king. That contrast is partly ideological, but not meaningless. The men at Marathon are defending more than fields. They are defending a city whose political identity is becoming tied to the idea that citizens should not kneel to one man. The Athenian victory is real, but it should not be exaggerated into the complete defeat of Persia. It is a defeat of one expedition, not the collapse of the empire. Persia remains enormous. Athens remains vulnerable. Yet the psychological effect is immense. A city that had nearly fallen back into tyranny now possesses a memory of having stood against the great king and survived. Marathon becomes proof that the impossible may not be impossible. It also becomes a dangerous source of pride. Victories can save a city, but they can also teach it to overestimate itself. A lesser-known detail is how strongly Marathon becomes tied to memory in physical and ritual form. The dead are honoured in a burial mound on the battlefield, not simply carried back and absorbed into ordinary graves. The landscape itself becomes a monument. Athens learns again what it has always done. It turns place into meaning. Just as the Acropolis holds older memories of kings, gods, and refuge, Marathon becomes a sacred geography of citizen courage. Generations later, Athenians will still invoke those who fought there, sometimes as moral ancestors against which later citizens are measured. But the Persian story does not end with Marathon. It only pauses. In the years that follow, Athens must decide what kind of power it wants to become. Themistocles, one of the sharpest and most controversial figures in Athenian history, sees what others may not wish to see clearly enough. Persia will return, and the next invasion may be far larger. He also sees that Athens' future lies not only on land but at sea. The silver of Laurion, that buried resource in the rocky landscape of Attica, now enters the fate of democracy. Instead of distributing a windfall among citizens, Athens is persuaded to invest in ships. The decision helps create a fleet of triremes, fast warships requiring skilled coordination and large crews. The hard land has produced silver. Silver becomes ships. Ships will transform the city. The trireme is more than a weapon. It changes the social balance of Athens. Hoplite warfare favours those wealthy enough to afford armour. Naval warfare depends heavily on rowers, many of them poorer citizens. When poorer citizens become essential to the survival of the city, their political importance grows. No single explanation fully accounts for the later radicalization of Athenian democracy, but naval power is one of its great engines. The sea does not merely protect Athens. It pulls the lower citizen classes deeper into the meaning of the state. A man who rows in the fleet can claim that his body, labour, and endurance carry the city through danger. In 480 BCE, the danger returns on a terrifying scale. Xerxes leads a massive invasion into Greece, crossing from Asia into Europe with forces drawn from across the empire. Ancient numbers are often exaggerated, and modern scholars remain cautious. But the impression of scale is undeniable. This is not a punitive raid like Marathon. It is a campaign meant to bring Greece into submission. Greek resistance forms unevenly, marked by courage, rivalry, hesitation, and disagreement among cities that do not naturally trust one another. Athens must confront an unthinkable choice to defend the city walls and risk annihilation, or to abandon the city itself and trust the fleet. The decision to evacuate Athens is one of the most haunting moments in its history. A city so rooted in place, ancestry, tombs, sanctuaries, and sacred stone must choose to become mobile. The citizens, their families, sacred objects, and movable goods are sent away as far as circumstances allow, while the fleet prepares for battle. The Acropolis, that old rock of refuge, is not enough. Some remain there, trusting in defences or divine protection, and the Persians take the city. The Acropolis burns. Temples and older sacred structures are damaged or destroyed. The symbolic heart of Athens is violated. For many cities, such a moment might have ended the story. Athens has lost its physical centre. Its sacred height is blackened. The enemy holds the ground where memory itself seems to live. But the strange strength of the new Athens is that the city is no longer only its buildings. it is also its citizens, its ships, its institutions, and its shared decision to continue. At Salamis, in the narrow waters near Attica, the Athenian-led Greek fleet strikes the Persian navy in conditions where numbers and imperial scale become less decisive. The victory does not belong to Athens alone, but Athens is central to it. The city that abandoned its stones saves itself through the sea. After Salamis, and after the later Greek victory at Plataea, Athens returns to a landscape of damage and possibility. The burned Acropolis becomes not only a wound, but a memory that can be used. The democracy has survived tyranny, reform, invasion, evacuation, and fire. Its citizens have learned that Athens can be destroyed in stone and still exist in collective action. That lesson will give the city extraordinary confidence. It will also feed the ambition that soon turns defense into dominance. Persia has pushed Athens to the edge, and at the edge Athens discovers a new version of itself: naval, proud, democratic, wounded, and dangerously ready to lead. After the Persian fires fade from the Acropolis, Athens returns not to innocence, but to opportunity. The city has been wounded in the most visible way possible. Its sacred height has been burned. Its older sanctuaries have been scarred. Families return to houses damaged or emptied by war. Farmers look again at fields disturbed by invasion. The dead have to be remembered, the gods honoured, the walls rebuilt, the ships maintained, and the future imagined before enemies or rivals can decide it for them. Athens has survived because it dared to leave itself behind and trust the sea. Now the question becomes whether that emergency choice will remain a temporary strategy or become the foundation of a new kind of power. Themistocles stands at the centre of this turn, brilliant, unsettling, and difficult to reduce to a simple heroic shape. He is the man who sees before many others that Athens cannot rely only on hoplite courage, old aristocratic prestige, or the protection of sacred places. The city's future depends on ships, harbours, crews, walls, money, and the political will to become maritime. He is not a gentle figure in the record. Ancient writers often portray him as cunning, ambitious, manipulative, and capable of bending truth when strategy requires it. Yet Athens owes much of its survival to precisely that kind of mind. In a crisis, clear virtue is useful, but so is dangerous intelligence. The silver from Laurion had already helped build the fleet before Xerxes came, and after the war the logic of sea power only grows stronger. A trireme is a demanding machine. It requires timber, maintenance, trained crews, command structures, storage, pay, and constant readiness. It is not enough to own ships. A city must become organized around them. The men who row cannot simply appear at the moment of battle with no experience. They must learn rhythm, endurance, obedience to commands, and trust in the narrow wooden body that carries them into violence. This means that naval power is not a single decision. It is a way of life. The new importance of Piraeus is crucial. Earlier Athens had looked toward the sea, but Themistocles helps turn that orientation into an integrated strategic system. Piraeus, with its excellent natural harbours, becomes the maritime counterpart to the inland city. The relationship between Athens and Piraeus reshapes Attica. The Acropolis remains the sacred and symbolic height. The Agora remains the civic heart. But Piraeus becomes the breathing lung of the new Athens, drawing in grain, timber, merchants, sailors, foreigners, news, and naval strength. The city is no longer only the settlement beneath the old rock. It is a connected organism stretching from Assembly Hill to harbour mouth. The rebuilding of the walls after the Persian Wars reveals how tense this new world already is. Sparta and some of its allies are uneasy about a fortified Athens. From a Spartan perspective, a walled and naval Athens may become more than a grateful partner in Greek resistance. It may become a rival. Themistocles is remembered for using delay, diplomacy, and deception, while the Athenians rebuild their defences as quickly as possible. The details in the sources are shaped by admiration and suspicion, and scholars still debate exactly how events unfolded, but the underlying truth is clear. Athens understands that freedom after Persia cannot depend on the goodwill of other Greek powers. The city must protect itself against enemies it has not yet named. The walls are more than stone. They are a political statement. A city with strong walls and a strong fleet can refuse orders. A city connected to its harbour can survive siege longer than an inland city cut off from food. Later, the long walls will make this logic even clearer, joining Athens to Piraeus in a fortified corridor that allows the city to live from the sea, even if enemies ravage the countryside. That later development belongs to the maturing naval empire, but its roots lie here, in the post-war realization that Athens has become inseparable from maritime strategy. The land that once forced ingenuity now pushes the city toward a grander and more dangerous form of dependence. In the years after the Persian invasion, many Greek cities remain afraid that Persia may return. The fear is not irrational. The empire has not disappeared. Greek communities in the Aegean and Asia Minor remain vulnerable. Out of this fear emerges the Delian League, an alliance originally centered on common defense against Persia. Its treasury is kept on the sacred island of Delos, a place of religious prestige and symbolic neutrality. Member states contribute ships or money. Athens, with its dominant fleet and recent prestige, becomes the leader. At first, the arrangement can be understood as practical. Someone must coordinate naval defense. Someone must patrol the Aegean. Someone must maintain pressure against Persian positions and protect Greek allies. But alliances have a way of changing when one member becomes indispensable. Athens supplies leadership, strategy, and naval force. But leadership becomes command, and command becomes control. Some allies prefer to pay tribute rather than provide ships, which only increases Athenian naval superiority. Cities that try to leave the League discover that voluntary alliance has hardened into obligation. Naxos and later Thasos become warnings that withdrawal will not be treated as a private choice. The evidence remains uneven in detail, but the direction is unmistakable. Athens is transforming the memory of collective Greek resistance into a system of Athenian power. This is one of the central contradictions of the city's rise. The democracy that celebrates citizen freedom builds an empire over other Greeks. Athenian citizens debate, vote, serve on juries, and hold officials accountable at home, while allied communities find their choices increasingly constrained by Athenian ships, garrisons, courts, tribute assessments, and political pressure. The Athenians may tell themselves that they provide security, punish traitors, protect the sea, and continue the war against Persia. There is truth in some of that. Pirates, Persian influence, and regional instability are real concerns, but no single explanation fully accounts for the shift from defense to empire. Fear, profit, prestige, ideology, habit, and opportunity all work together. A lesser known but revealing detail lies in the administrative side of empire. Tribute does not remain an abstract flow of wealth. It is assessed, recorded, carried, displayed, and inscribed. Lists of allied payments become public documents. turning imperial extraction into civic knowledge. The movement of money from island and coastal communities into Athenian hands strengthens the democracy materially. It helps support fleets, public works, officials, jurors, festivals, and the wider machinery of civic life. The Athenian citizen can experience democracy as participation and freedom, while the resources that help sustain that experience increasingly come from outside the citizen body. The city's internal equality among citizens grows alongside external inequality among allies. Themistocles himself does not remain securely honoured. Athenian politics rarely allows even great saviours to rest safely in gratitude. He is eventually ostracised, and later traditions place him in Persian service. A stunning reversal for the man most associated with Greek naval resistance at Salamis. The exact motives and accusations surrounding his fall are tangled, but his career reveals something essential about Athens. The city can use extraordinary individuals, celebrate them, fear them, and cast them out. Ostracism is not an accident in such a culture. It is a reminder that democratic Athens wants leaders, but not masters. Even the man who helped save the city can become too large for comfort. By the middle of the 5th century BCE, Athens is no longer merely a survivor of Persian invasion. It is the centre of a maritime system. Its harbour is crowded. Its fleet is a political fact. Its poorer citizens have gained weight because their labour at the oars matters. Its allies are becoming subjects in all but name. Its public spaces are filling with the confidence of a city that has discovered power on a scale earlier generations could hardly have imagined. The burned stones of the Acropolis still remember vulnerability, but the ships at Piraeus speak of reach. Athens has learned to turn fear into strategy, strategy into leadership, and leadership into empire. What began as survival at sea is becoming the foundation of its most dazzling age, and of the moral tension that will never leave it. The Athens that rises into the age of Pericles is a city glittering with confidence, but the shine is not innocent. It comes from victory, silver, tribute, ships, labour, memory, and a kind of political daring that few ancient societies ever attempt. The Persians have burned the Acropolis, and the Athenians have returned not with the desire to hide their wound, but with the ambition to turn it into stone, ritual, and public meaning. The city that once survived by abandoning its own sacred centre now begins to rebuild that centre as if marble itself can answer fire. Out of this moment comes the image of Athens that later centuries will remember most vividly: temples above the city, drama below, arguments in the Agora, citizens paid to serve, and a democracy strong enough to astonish the world while troubling anyone who looks too closely at the foundations beneath it. Pericles stands within this transformation as both leader and symbol. He is not a king, and that distinction matters deeply. He cannot simply command Athens as a monarch commands subjects. His power depends on persuasion, repeated public trust, strategic skill, aristocratic background, and the ability to make his policies feel like expressions of the citizen body itself. He is elected again and again as general, one of the offices chosen by vote rather than lot, because military command requires expertise in a way ordinary administrative offices often do not. In theory, he remains accountable to the people. In practice, his influence becomes so great that later observers struggle to describe whether Athens is being led by democracy or by one man through democracy. Scholars still debate the balance between popular power and elite leadership in this period, but the tension is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Under Pericles, the democratic system becomes more deeply rooted. Public pay for jury service and other civic duties helps poorer citizens participate more fully in government. This is a crucial development. A democracy that requires citizens to attend courts, assemblies, councils, and offices cannot function broadly if only the wealthy have the leisure to serve. Payment does not erase inequality, but it changes the practical meaning of citizenship. A poor citizen who can afford to sit on a jury is not merely honoured in theory, he becomes part of the machinery of justice. The city is investing in participation. Critics will complain that such pay encourages dependency or empowers the crowd too much, while supporters see it as the material condition of freedom. No single explanation fully accounts for its impact, but it clearly helps make Athenian democracy more active, more crowded, and more radical. The courts become one of the great stages of this civic world. Hundreds of jurors may hear a case, speeches are crafted with care, litigants appeal not only to law, but to character, memory, service, fear, pity, resentment, and civic ideals. It is messy, emotional, and deeply public. Athens does not separate politics, law, reputation, and rhetoric as cleanly as later systems might wish. Yet this mixture gives ordinary citizens extraordinary authority. The people judge officials, private disputes, public accusations, and sometimes matters that shape the city's direction. A man who wants influence in Athens must be able to face citizens who believe they have the right to question him. The building program on the Acropolis gives this democratic energy a visible crown. The Parthenon, the Propylaea, the Temple of Athena Nike, and later the Erechtheion transform the old sacred height into one of the most powerful architectural statements in human history. But these monuments should not be seen only as beautiful objects floating above politics. They are built in the aftermath of destruction, in the age of empire, under a democracy that wants to display devotion, gratitude, wealth, technical brilliance, and civic supremacy. The Parthenon honours Athena, but it also speaks to allies, rivals, citizens, foreigners, and future memory. Its marble surfaces turn Athenian identity into something that can be seen from below, approached in procession and imagined as eternal. Yet the money behind this beauty remains morally charged. Funds connected to the Athenian Empire, including resources once associated with the common defence of Greek allies, help sustain the city's grand projects. The treasury of the Delian League is moved from Delos to Athens, a practical and symbolic act that confirms how far leadership has hardened into dominance. Athenians can argue that they protect the Aegean, maintain the fleet, and deserve the means to honour the gods whose city stands at the centre of that protection. Their critics can answer that Athens is using allied wealth to adorn itself. The evidence and ancient arguments do not allow a simple verdict that satisfies every angle. What survives suggests a city capable of genuine religious devotion, civic pride, artistic genius, and imperial extraction at the same time. The Acropolis Museum today preserves fragments of this world in a way that reminds us how incomplete the ancient surface now is. Sculptures that once carried colour, bronze fittings, painted detail, and ritual context are often encountered now as pale stone, separated from the noise, smoke, sacrifice, music, cloth, and movement of ancient worship. The modern eye sees clean marble, but classical Athens was not monochrome silence. It was brighter, busier, and more sensory than the ruins can easily convey. The Panathenaic procession, with citizens, officials, animals, woven offerings, and sacred gestures, made the city's hierarchy and unity visible. Religion was not a private corner of life. It was one of the languages through which Athens understood itself. Below the Acropolis, the theatre of Dionysus and the festival culture of Athens produce another kind of monument, one made of words, masks, bodies, and collective attention. Tragedy flourishes in the same city that debates policy and commands an empire. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides do not write entertainment in the shallow sense. Their plays explore divine justice, human error, pride, grief, law, revenge, civic order, and the terrible cost of decision, comedy. Especially later in the century, gives Athens the even stranger gift of mocking itself in public. Leaders, policies, philosophers, generals, and ordinary habits can be ridiculed before citizen audiences. A society that permits public laughter at power is not automatically wise, but it is unusually self-aware. The surprising detail is how connected these cultural achievements are to civic structure. Drama competitions are religious events, public events, political events, and artistic events at once. Wealthy citizens may finance choruses as a form of liturgy, turning elite money into public performance. Citizens sit together and watch myths that are not merely old stories, but mirrors held up to the city's own anxieties. A tragedy about a doomed royal house can speak to a democracy afraid of arrogance. A play about law and blood vengeance can echo the city's own struggle to replace private retaliation with civic judgment. Athens thinks in public, and sometimes it does so through gods and heroes. Daily life in the Periclean city is not all marble and theatre. The Agora remains crowded with trade, gossip, legal business, workshops, shrines, statues, and administrative buildings. Piraeus hums with sailors, merchants, shipwrights, metics, enslaved labourers, and goods from far beyond Attica. Grain imports become vital, silver, tribute, and maritime routes keep the city alive. The democracy depends on participation, but participation depends on an economy supported by women's household labour, enslaved labour, allied payments, and foreign residents without full political rights. The citizen speaking proudly of freedom may walk past people whose lives expose the limits of that word. Athens is never less fascinating for this contradiction. It is more revealing because of it. Pericles' Athens therefore stands as a golden tension, not a golden age in the simple old phrase. It is a society of astonishing creativity and disciplined civic practice, but also of imperial pressure, exclusion, rivalry, and risk. Its temples are acts of worship and statements of power. Its democracy expands participation for male citizens, while resting on boundaries it rarely questions. Its philosophers and playwrights probe human weakness, even as the city itself grows more confident. Its public spaces make citizenship visible, but also remind us who remains unseen. Athens at its height does not resolve the ancient problem of freedom and power. It makes that problem visible in marble, law, speech, money, and memory, and for a brief, dazzling moment. The city seems to believe that it can hold all these contradictions together without being broken by them. In the city that believes public speech can shape destiny, philosophy does not arrive as a quiet ornament. It grows in the open air, among laws, trials, markets, temples, military anxieties, imperial money, and men who know that a persuasive argument can move ships, condemn officials, approve expenditures, honour the dead, or send an army across the sea. Athens has become a city of voices, and once a society gives so much power to speech, it cannot avoid asking what speech is worth. Is a convincing argument the same as a true one? Is justice what the city votes for, or something that stands beyond the city? Can a citizen be good if he wins every debate, but does not know what goodness means? These questions do not belong to a schoolroom. In Athens, they belong to the street. The sophists enter this world as teachers of skill, and their reputation will never fully recover from the suspicion later philosophers cast upon them. They travel, teach, charge fees, and offer instruction in rhetoric, virtue, political success, and the arts of argument. To many ambitious Athenians, this is not decadence but necessity. A democracy that rewards public speaking creates demand for people who can teach men how to speak. A court system filled with citizen jurors makes persuasion practical. An assembly deciding war and peace makes verbal power almost as important as inherited wealth. The sophists do not create this environment. They reveal it. They are symptoms of a city where success increasingly depends on the ability to make a case before others. Yet they also disturb older certainties. Some sophists compare laws and customs across cities, suggesting that what one polis calls natural may simply be traditional. Others analyze language, probability, political advantage, and the gap between appearance and reality. The Athenian who hears such teaching may become sharper, more flexible, more skeptical, and more dangerous. Conservative critics fear that cleverness can dissolve reverence, that young men trained to argue both sides of a case may learn to defeat justice rather than serve it. That fear is not entirely foolish. Any society that prizes persuasion must face the possibility that persuasion can be separated from truth. But the opposite danger is also real. A city that fears argument too much may mistake obedience for wisdom. Into this atmosphere walks Socrates, one of the most famous and least easily captured figures in the ancient world. He leaves no writings of his own. What survives comes through others, especially Plato, Xenophon, Aristophanes, and later traditions, each with different purposes and distortions. Scholars still debate how much of the historical Socrates can be recovered from these portraits, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet even through the layers, one figure keeps appearing. A man who refuses to treat reputation as knowledge, who questions generals about courage, politicians about justice, poets about wisdom, and citizens about the life they claim to understand. He does not build temples or command fleets. He unsettles people in conversation. Socrates belongs deeply to Athens. He's not a wandering sage from some distant mountain, removed from civic life. He serves as a soldier, endures hardship on campaign, walks the Agora, knows the habits of the city, and speaks with men who expect public life to matter. His method fits Athens perfectly and threatens it perfectly. The democracy depends on citizens believing they can judge. Socrates keeps asking whether they know what they are judging. The city honors speech. Socrates tests speech until it breaks. The city admires virtue. Socrates asks what virtue is. The city remembers victory and public service. Socrates suggests that an unexamined confidence may be a kind of ignorance. This makes him both profoundly Athenian and profoundly inconvenient. He does not reject public life in the simple manner of a hermit. He insists that the soul, justice, and truth matter more than applause, wealth, or office. That claim sounds noble from a distance, but in a tense democracy it can feel like an accusation. When Socrates exposes confusion in respected men, he's not merely playing with ideas, he is touching honour, authority, and the fragile self-belief of a political community. Athens has survived Persia, built an empire, paid citizens to judge, raised temples above the burned rock, and filled theatres with tragic wisdom. But Socrates presses on a quieter wound. Perhaps the city does not know itself as well as it thinks. Philosophy in Athens also grows from contact with older traditions of inquiry. Thinkers before Socrates, often grouped under the broad label of pre-Socratics, had already asked about nature, change, being, number, perception, and the underlying order of the world. Some came from Ionia, southern Italy, or other Greek regions rather than Athens itself. The city becomes influential not because it invents every question, but because it gathers questions into a uniquely public and politically charged environment. In Athens, speculation about nature meets argument about law, metaphysics touches ethics, teaching becomes suspicious because it may shape citizens, and thought becomes part of the drama of civic identity. The theatre and philosophy speak to each other more than they may first appear. Tragedy has already forced Athenians to confront the limits of human knowledge, the danger of pride, the conflict between divine law and civic law, the suffering caused by decisions made under uncertainty. Comedy mocks intellectual fashions, including Socrates himself, turning philosophers into figures of public laughter. This is a lesser-known key to Athens' brilliance. Serious thought does not exist in a protected silence. It is watched, laughed at, misunderstood, politicized, admired, and attacked. Ideas in Athens have an audience, and an audience can sharpen or deform them. The Peloponnesian War, already gathering force in the background of this intellectual world, darkens the meaning of every question. When a city is confident, philosophy can seem like refinement. When a city is at war, philosophy becomes more dangerous. Questions about justice are no longer abstract when Athens rules allies harshly, debates punishment, suffers plague, and sends men to die. Questions about courage are not academic when hoplites and sailors face real campaigns. Questions about good leadership matter when demagogues, generals, and elite advisors compete before a fearful people. No single explanation fully accounts for the intensity of Athenian thought, but war, democracy, empire, and public speech together create a pressure chamber for the mind. Plato, still young during the later phases of Athens' crisis, will inherit this world and transform its wounds into philosophy of extraordinary reach. His dialogues preserve Socrates as a questioning force, but they also respond to the failures Plato sees around him, the instability of democracy, the seductions of rhetoric, the execution of a man he treats as just, and the problem of whether political life can ever be guided by knowledge rather than appetite. Aristotle, later still, will study constitutions, biology, ethics, logic, poetry, and politics with a different temperament, more systematic and observational, but still within the long shadow of the Athenian experiment. The city gives philosophy not only questions, but urgency. Athens becomes the most influential intellectual society in history, not because every Athenian is wise, and not because its democracy produces truth automatically. It becomes influential because it brings freedom, conflict, speech, leisure, inequality, empire, religious tradition, artistic performance, legal argument, and public scrutiny into unstable contact. Its citizens are proud enough to debate everything and insecure enough to fear what debate reveals. Its thinkers ask whether power can be just, whether knowledge can guide life, whether virtue can be taught, whether the many can rule wisely, and whether a city can survive the truth about itself. Philosophy rises from Athens not like a calm statue, but like a spark struck from stone. The same city that builds the Parthenon also produces the man who asks whether beauty, power, and success mean anything without the examined life. Behind the marble face of Athens, life is denser, rougher, louder, and more unequal than the surviving monuments first suggest. The city that gives the world political theory, tragedy, philosophy. And the image of citizens debating beneath an open sky is also a city of smoke-darkened rooms, crowded workshops, market noise, religious obligations, household labour, imported grain, enslaved workers, resident foreigners, anxious fathers, managed marriages, patched clothing, oil lamps, bad smells, legal worries, and ordinary people trying to get through the day. The Parthenon rises above them all, but most Athenians do not live in marble. They live in mud brick, timber, plaster, tile, and routine. The typical Athenian house is not designed to impress the street. Many homes turn inward, with rooms arranged around a courtyard that brings light and air into domestic space. From outside, a house may look modest or plain. Inside, it is a working organism. Food is stored, wool is spun, cloth is woven, accounts are remembered, rituals are performed, guests may be received, and family continuity is protected. The household, or oikos, is the basic unit beneath the grand language of citizenship. A man may speak in the assembly, serve on a jury, or row in the fleet, but his public identity depends on a private structure that the city rarely celebrates with equal grandeur. Women in citizen families occupy a central yet restricted place in this world. Their lives are difficult to reconstruct because most surviving texts are written by men and shaped by public concerns. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the gap between prescriptive ideals and daily practice. Athenian ideology often imagines respectable women as guarded within the household, responsible for textile production, servants, storage, religious duties, and legitimate descent. But real lives are rarely as rigid as ideology. Women appear in religious festivals, funerary contexts, family property arrangements, labour, neighbourhood life, and moments of crisis. They do not vote in the assembly, but the city cannot reproduce itself, ritually or biologically stastor, without them. Athens praises citizen freedom while placing much of the maintenance of that citizen world in hands excluded from formal politics. Religious life gives some of those hidden structures public shape. Festivals are not decorative interruptions in ancient life. They are part of how time itself is organized. The city's calendar is thick with sacrifices, processions, contests, offerings, and days dedicated to gods, heroes, and civic memory. Athena stands at the center of Athenian identity, but she does not stand alone. Dionysus, Demeter, Apollo, Artemis, Zeus, Hephaestus, and countless local heroes occupy the sacred landscape. Household gods and public gods overlap. A citizen may argue fiercely in court and still carefully observe ritual duties. To modernize, politics and religion may look like separate realms, but in Athens they are braided together. A public decision, a military campaign, a theatrical festival, and a harvest anxiety can all belong to the same sacred world. Children, when they appear in this story, should be imagined within that protective household and ritual frame rather than as miniature public citizens. Boys born to citizen families are raised toward eventual civic identity, military obligation, and public responsibility, while girls are prepared for household roles shaped by family alliances and religious expectations. Their early lives leave few direct traces, and what survives tends to come through objects, graves, toys, images. and adult assumptions. The point is not to romanticize childhood in antiquity, but to recognize how carefully family continuity matters in a city obsessed with legitimate descent and citizenship. A child's place in the household is also a place in the future of the polis. Outside the house, Athens is full of work. The Agora, which later visitors may imagine as a serene civic square, is in daily life a busy and mixed environment. Food sellers, potters, leather workers, metal workers, bankers, money changers, public slaves, magistrates, philosophers, farmers, litigants, and idlers all pass through it. The smells of oil, animals, fish, sweat, smoke, and dust mingle with political rumour. A man may come to buy something, hear a lawsuit discussed, encounter a decree, meet a creditor, listen to a teacher, or be drawn into conversation about a military expedition. The Agora is not merely where democracy is administered, it is where the city overhears itself. The crafts of Athens deserve as much attention as its speeches. Pottery workshops produce vessels that travel across the Mediterranean, carrying Athenian style far beyond Attica. Vase painters turn everyday objects into surfaces of myth, ceremony, athletic training, revelry, labour, and war memory. Metalworkers make tools, weapons, fittings, dedications, and domestic objects. Sculptors, masons, carpenters, shipwrights, tanners, fullers, and builders give the city its material body. Some are citizens, some metics, some enslaved. A lesser-known detail is that many of the most cosmopolitan and technically skilled people in Athens are not full citizens at all. Metics, resident foreigners, contribute heavily to trade, manufacture, banking, and intellectual life. Yet they remain politically excluded and must meet legal obligations to reside in the city. Athens is open enough to use talent from elsewhere, but not open enough to grant it equal belonging. Enslavement is one of the deepest shadows beneath Athenian achievement. Enslaved people work in households, workshops, agriculture, administration, and the mines. Some perform skilled labour. Some may manage money or conduct business on behalf of owners. Others endure brutally hard conditions, especially in mining contexts such as Lorien. The democracy's freedom for citizens rests in part on unfree labour, and that fact cannot be softened without distorting the city. Athenians can speak beautifully about liberty while accepting a system that denies liberty to many around them. This contradiction is not an accidental footnote. It is built into the ancient world that makes Athens possible. Food connects Athens to its limits. Attica produces olives, figs, wine, barley, vegetables, and animal products. But the city's population and ambitions make imported grain increasingly vital. Ships bringing grain are not luxuries, they are instruments of survival. Athenian concern with sea lanes, alliances, colonies, kleruches, and control of maritime routes is partly strategic and partly dietary. A democracy can debate nobly, but hungry citizens become dangerous citizens. The stomach lies close beneath political theory. No single explanation fully accounts for Athenian imperial behaviour, but the need to secure food and trade routes helps explain why a city proud of freedom becomes so determined to control the sea. Clothing, too, tells a quieter story. Most garments are made from wool or linen, shaped less by cutting and tailoring than by draping, fastening, and belting. Textile production is labour-intensive, and much of it belongs to the domestic world of women and servants. Every cloak, tunic, and woven offering represents hours of work that rarely appear in political histories. The great robe presented to Athena at the Panathenaea, woven with sacred care. turns household skill into civic ritual on a monumental scale. In that moment, the hidden labour of textile production becomes visible as devotion, identity, and public splendour. Daily Athens is therefore a city of layers. Above, the Acropolis presents an idealized face of order, piety, and power. In the assembly, citizens speak of policy and freedom. In the courts, they argue over justice. In the theatre, they watch kings. Gods and broken households reveal truths too dangerous for ordinary speech. But below and around all this, life continues through grinding labour, private anxieties, market bargains, family strategies, religious habits, and the work of people excluded from the celebrated citizen voice. The Athens that changes history is not only the Athens of Pericles and Socrates, it is also the Athens of unnamed women at looms, enslaved miners beneath the earth, metic craftsmen in workshops, farmers watching the sky, sailors sleeping near the harbour, and citizens walking from ordinary houses into extraordinary political responsibility. That is why the city remains so powerful to imagine. Its greatness is not pure, and its contradictions are not minor, but its public brilliance becomes more real, not less, when set against the crowded human life behind it. Athens is not a marble abstraction. It is a living society, full of limits, exclusions, creativity, noise, and dependence. The same city that asks what justice is must buy fish in the Agora, repair ships at Piraeus, arrange marriages, fear grain shortages, honour gods, manage slaves, and listen for rumours of war. Behind the shining temples stands the daily machinery of survival, and without that machinery, there is no democracy, no philosophy, no golden age, and no Athens for later centuries to remember. The same forces that make Athens powerful also make it vulnerable. The fleet that secures grain routes and commands the Aegean depends on money, crews, tribute, allies, and constant confidence. The democracy that gives citizens a voice depends on persuasion, discipline, patience, and trust that public judgment will remain clear under pressure. The empire that enriches Athens also frightens its rivals. By the time war with Sparta and its allies becomes unavoidable, Athens is no longer the small city that once faced Persia at Marathon. It is a naval power, an imperial centre, a democracy proud of its freedom, and a city whose greatness has begun to look, to others, like a threat that cannot be ignored forever. The Peloponnesian War is not a sudden storm from a clear sky. It gathers slowly through rivalry, alliance obligations, fear, resentment, and competing visions of what Greece should become after the Persian Wars. Sparta leads a land-based alliance rooted in the Peloponnese, cautious in some ways, severe in others, and suspicious of Athenian expansion. Athens leads a maritime empire that began as an anti-Persian league and has hardened into control. Between them stand smaller cities whose disputes can pull great powers toward conflict. Ancient explanations already recognized that the immediate causes and the deeper causes were not the same. Specific quarrels matter, but beneath them lies the growth of Athenian power and the fear that growth inspires. Scholars still debate the balance of responsibility, but no single explanation fully accounts for the war. It is ambition, fear, prestige, miscalculation, economics, ideology, and the terrible momentum of alliance systems all moving together. Pericles' strategy reflects the logic Athens has built over decades. He does not seek to defeat Sparta in a great land battle. Sparta's strength lies in its hoplite army and its ability to invade Attica. Athens' strength lies in ships, walls, money, and access to the sea. The plan is harsh but coherent. Withdraw the rural population behind the city's fortifications, avoid decisive land battle, protect the empire by fleet, and wait for Spartan pressure to exhaust itself. The long walls linking Athens to Piraeus make this possible. They turn the city and harbour into one defended organism, a fortress tied to maritime supply. In strategic terms, it is brilliant. In human terms, it asks the people of Attica to watch their fields, homes, and local shrines exposed while they crowd into the urban centre. The crowding changes Athens. Farmers who had lived across the countryside are pulled into the city, bringing families, belongings, animals, memories, and anxiety. The city becomes more congested, more strained, more dependent on imported food and water systems, more emotionally charged. The war is no longer an abstract policy debated in the assembly. It is present in bodies sleeping in temporary spaces, in citizens seeing smoke rise from land they know, in the pressure of too many people held behind walls while the enemy moves outside. The democracy has asked its citizens to trust a strategy that protects the state while sacrificing the countryside. That trust is not easy to maintain. Then the plague comes. Around 430 BCE, a devastating epidemic strikes Athens, spreading through the overcrowded city and shattering confidence at the worst possible moment. Ancient descriptions preserve the terror of a disease that people do not understand, though modern scholars still debate its exact identity. What matters for the Athenian story is not only the death toll, severe as it is, but the moral and political shock. Ritual habits falter, social order strains. Citizens who once believed in strategy, walls, ships, and collective discipline confront an enemy that no fleet can ram and no assembly can vote away. The city that has mastered so many public instruments of control is forced to face biological helplessness. Pericles himself dies during this crisis, and with him Athens loses not merely a leader, but a kind of political balance. His authority had never been absolute, yet it had steadied the democracy by giving its ambitions a disciplined form. After him, the assembly remains sovereign, the courts continue, the fleet operates, and the empire survives. But the tone of public life shifts. More aggressive leaders compete for influence. Popular anger becomes easier to mobilize. Elite suspicion deepens. War compresses time, and decisions made under fear can become harsher than decisions made under confidence. The system does not collapse immediately, which is important. Athenian democracy is resilient, but resilience is not the same as wisdom. The empire now becomes both asset and burden. Tribute, ships, and allied bases allow Athens to continue fighting, but rebellion among subject allies threatens the entire structure. If one city successfully breaks away, others may follow. Athens therefore reacts with severity, because weakness can spread like fire through an imperial system. The revolt of Mytilene becomes one of the clearest windows into the moral danger of democratic empire. In the assembly, anger first drives the Athenians toward an extreme punishment, then a second debate reverses part of the decision. The episode reveals something unsettling and deeply human. Democracy can correct itself, but only after coming close to disaster. Public deliberation is powerful, yet it can be swept by rage before reflection catches up. The war also exposes the gap between Athenian ideals and imperial behaviour. When Athens deals with weaker communities, its language of freedom often gives way to the language of necessity. The most famous example is the treatment of Melos, a small island that tries to remain neutral. The Athenians demand submission. The Melians appeal to justice, hope, and the gods. Athens insists on power, security, and the realities of empire. The later literary framing of this confrontation is shaped by Thucydides, and historians continue to discuss how closely it reflects actual speeches. But the moral force of the episode is unmistakable. A city that celebrates its own refusal to submit to Persia now demands submission from others. The mirror is not flattering. Meanwhile, the intellectual life of Athens darkens. Tragedy continues to probe the cost of pride, error, and divine uncertainty. Comedy attacks leaders and public foolishness with sharper teeth. Philosophical questioning grows more urgent because the city's decisions are no longer safely glorious. War makes abstract virtues bleed into policy. Courage may become recklessness. Prudence may look like cowardice. Justice may be reduced to advantage. Patriotism may excuse cruelty. The same public speech that once gave democracy its voice can now inflame suspicion, promise easy victories, or turn complexity into slogans. Athens remains brilliant, but brilliance under pressure can become feverish. The Sicilian expedition becomes the great catastrophe of overreach. Athens decides to send a massive force far across the sea to Sicily, aiming at power, wealth, prestige, and strategic advantage beyond the immediate theatre of war. The plan reflects the imperial imagination at its most expansive. If Athens can reach so far, command so much, and reshape the Western Greek world, then perhaps the war can be transformed. Yet the distance itself should have warned them. Sicily is not a nearby rebellious ally. It is a vast and difficult arena filled with local politics, strong cities, uncertain intelligence, and logistical danger. The evidence suggests a mixture of ambition, hope, rivalry among leaders, and public enthusiasm that outruns sober calculation. The result is ruin. The Athenian force becomes trapped, worn down, and finally destroyed. Ships are lost. Men are lost. Confidence is shattered. The disaster is not merely military, it is psychological. A naval democracy has gambled its strength far from home and watched that strength disappear. Back in Athens, the news must have felt almost impossible to absorb. The city has survived invasion, fire, plague, and years of war. But Sicily reveals a more frightening enemy, the city's own appetite. No Spartan army could have forced Athens to choose that expedition. The decision came from within. After Sicily, the experiment enters its most dangerous phase. Allies revolt. Persia becomes involved in Greek affairs again, supplying money and opportunity to Athens's enemies. Sparta learns slowly but effectively how to challenge Athenian sea power. At home, confidence in the democracy weakens. Some citizens and elites begin to ask whether the system itself is responsible for catastrophe. The old fear returns in a new form. Perhaps the many can be misled. Perhaps public speech rewards the reckless. Perhaps the city that gave citizens power has also given them the power to destroy themselves. Yet even now Athens does not simply vanish. It fights on with astonishing energy. Fleets are rebuilt, leaders rise and fall, assemblies continue, courts continue, the Agora still fills, the democracy, battered and blamed, remains alive. That endurance is one of the most remarkable parts of the story. The war devours Athens slowly, not because the city lacks strength, but because it has so much strength that it can survive long enough to make repeated mistakes. Its institutions keep functioning under strain, its citizens keep deciding, its ships keep sailing. But the golden tension of Periclean Athens has become something harsher. Freedom and empire, speech and manipulation, courage and overreach, resilience and exhaustion are now locked together. The city that once discovered itself at sea is beginning to drown in the consequences of its own power. After the Sicilian disaster, Athens enters a period in which defeat is no longer an event to be feared in the distance, but a pressure felt every day in the city's political nerves. The empire that once seemed to make Athens almost unsinkable begins to loosen at its edges. Allies revolt or hesitate. Persian money returns to Greek warfare as a quiet and decisive force, supporting Sparta's effort to build the naval strength it once lacked. Athenian citizens who had trusted ships, walls, silver, and argument to carry them through crisis, now face a more corrosive fear. Perhaps the system that made Athens powerful has also made it reckless. Perhaps the assembly can be persuaded into catastrophe. Perhaps freedom, when joined to empire and panic, can turn against itself. This fear opens the door to oligarchic conspiracy. In 411 BCE, a group of Athenians attempts to replace the democracy with a narrower regime. Later remembered as the rule of the 400, they present their movement as emergency reform, a way to save the city by putting power into the hands of fewer, supposedly wiser, wealthier, and more disciplined men. That language is familiar in moments of crisis. When a democracy suffers defeat, its enemies rarely begin by saying they hate the city. They claim they are rescuing it. The details of the coup remain debated in places, especially because our sources are shaped by political memory and later interpretation. But the broad fact is clear: Athens' own citizens, under the stress of war, turn against the democratic order from within. The coup does not hold for long. The fleet at Samos, heavily democratic in spirit and filled with men whose power depends on naval service, refuses to accept the new order easily. This is a crucial moment because it shows that Athens is no longer only the city behind the walls. Athens is also its fleet, its rowers, its commanders, its maritime citizens, and the imperial network through which it survives. The democracy has become portable in the same way the city had become portable during the Persian invasion. When political power is seized at home, the democratic claim can continue at sea. The 400 fall, and a broader but still restricted regime of the 5,000 briefly takes shape before fuller democracy is restored. The episode leaves scars, but it also proves that the democratic habit is hard to kill. Still, restoration does not mean recovery. Athens continues to fight, sometimes with astonishing success, sometimes with terrible misjudgment. The naval victory at Arginusi in 406 BCE should have been a moment of relief, but it becomes another wound. After the battle, storm conditions prevent the rescue of some shipwrecked men and the recovery of bodies. The generals are tried, and several are executed after a controversial collective proceeding that later generations treat as a sign of democratic anger, overwhelming lawful procedure. Scholars still debate the exact legal and political details, but the moral impression is severe. A city under pressure can punish its own servants for the unbearable cost of war, as if blame might restore the dead or steady the future. Then comes Agospotami in 405 BCE, the disaster that finally breaks Athenian sea power. The Spartan commander Lysander catches the Athenian fleet in a vulnerable position near the Hellespont, and the ships on which Athens depends are captured or destroyed. The route by which grain reaches the city is now exposed. The walls that once symbolized strategic genius become the outline of a trap. Athens can no longer trust the sea to save it. Hunger and inevitability begin to close in 404 BCE. Athens surrenders. The long walls are torn down to the sound of celebration by its enemies, according to later tradition, as if Greece is witnessing the liberation of itself from Athenian arrogance. For Athenians, the destruction of the walls must have felt like the unmaking of the world Themistocles and Pericles had built. The surrender brings not peace, but humiliation and terror. Sparta installs or supports an oligarchic regime remembered as the 30 Tyrants. Their rule is brief, but brutal in political memory. They purge enemies, seize property, execute opponents, and narrow the citizen body. Critias, one of their leading figures, becomes a symbol of aristocratic extremism and intellectual corruption, especially because of his association with Socrates. The evidence for every motive and action remains shaped by hostile memory, but the regime's violence is not in doubt. Athens learns that the alternative to democracy is not necessarily wise restraint. It can be revenge dressed as order. Resistance forms among exiles and democrats, and in 403 BCE the democracy is restored again. This restoration is one of the most remarkable acts in Athenian history because it does not simply unleash endless vengeance. A general amnesty is established, limiting retaliation for past political acts except in specific cases. The city chooses, or is forced by necessity to choose, a form of forgetting that is not true forgetting at all, but a civic discipline against permanent civil war. The Athenians know too much about one another. Neighbour has accused neighbour. Some have profited under oligarchy. Some have fled. Some have returned armed. Without restraint, the city could devour itself long after Sparta has won. The amnesty becomes a political technology of survival. The restored democracy is not the same as the confident democracy of the imperial age. It is poorer, chastened, watched, and more legally cautious. The late 5th and 4th centuries see changes in lawmaking that separate decrees from more stable laws, strengthen procedures, and reflect the memory of how easily public decision can be distorted under pressure. Athens is no longer an empire commanding tribute across the Aegean in the old way, but it remains culturally and intellectually powerful. Indeed, its defeat helps sharpen its thought. The question of what went wrong becomes part of the city's legacy. Then, in 399 BCE, Athens puts Socrates on trial. The charges concern impiety and the corruption of the young, but the atmosphere around the trial is thick with recent trauma. Socrates has connections, direct or indirect, with men who became associated with oligarchic danger, including Critias and Alcibiades, though he cannot simply be reduced to their politics. The democracy has survived coups, defeat, tyranny, and restoration. It is sensitive to anything that seems to weaken civic loyalty, religious respect, or the moral education of citizens. Socrates' questioning, once part of the city's restless intellectual life, now appears to some as a threat. To others, his execution will become the city's greatest moral failure. The trial is not a simple case of ignorant democracy killing philosophy. That version is too easy and too clean. The Athenians who condemned Socrates lived through catastrophe and civil conflict. They had reasons, fears, resentments, and memories. Even if the verdict remains troubling, Socrates, for his part, refuses to behave like a man begging for acquittal. He stands as if the court itself is on trial. No single explanation fully accounts for the outcome. Religion, politics, personality, generational tension, and the wounds of the recent past all gather in that courtroom. When he dies, Athens does not merely kill an old questioner, it creates a symbol that will outlive the democracy that condemned him. And yet Athens continues. That may be the strangest part. The city is defeated, morally wounded and stripped of empire, but it does not fall silent. Plato writes, Isocrates teaches, The academy is founded, orators refine political language, law courts remain active, the Agora still gathers citizens, traders, foreigners, thinkers, and gossip. Athens becomes less the ruler of Greece and more its school, though even that phrase simplifies a living, competitive, imperfect city. Its influence deepens precisely because it has suffered enough to think about failure. Democracy survives not as innocence, but as recovery. Philosophy survives not as luxury, but as a response to the city's mistakes. The Athens that emerges from defeat is no longer the Athens that believed marble, ships, and public speech could hold every contradiction together. It is something more fragile, more self-conscious, and in the long memory of the world, perhaps even more powerful. Athens survives the Peloponnesian War, the oligarchic coup, the 30, the trial of Socrates, and the loss of empire. But survival is not the same as recovery of command. The 4th century city is still loud, intelligent, legally active, artistically alive, and politically self-conscious. Yet the world around it is changing faster than its old habits can master. The age when Athens could dominate the Aegean by fleet, tribute, and confidence has passed. Sparta rises and stumbles. Thebes briefly astonishes Greece with military power. Alliances form and dissolve. Persia remains a distant but influential presence, money and diplomacy flowing through Greek rivalries like an invisible current. The polis, that intense little world of citizen assemblies, local pride, sacred calendars, and hoplite memories, still feels to its inhabitants like the natural centre of political life. But beyond the old city-states, a larger kind of power is gathering in Macedon. Macedon had long been treated by many southern Greeks as rough, peripheral, and not quite part of their refined political world, though that judgment says as much about Greek prejudice as about Macedonian reality. Under Philip II, it becomes something far more formidable, a kingdom with military innovation, diplomacy, wealth, cavalry, siegecraft, and a ruler capable of exploiting every fracture in Greek politics. Philip does not defeat the Greek cities merely because Macedon is strong. He succeeds because the Greek world is divided, exhausted, proud, suspicious, and often unable to act together until the danger is already too close. Athens sees the threat, argues about it, denounces it, negotiates with it, underestimates it, and fears it. The old democratic machinery continues to operate, but the scale of the problem has changed. Demosthenes becomes the great voice of resistance, warning Athenians that Philip's rise is not a distant inconvenience but a mortal danger to Greek freedom. His speeches show that the old Athenian power of public persuasion remains alive. Words still matter. The assembly still hears arguments. Citizens still decide. Yet persuasion is now struggling against geography, military reform, money, time, and the hard fact that Athens no longer commands the resources of its imperial youth. The city can still speak with brilliance, but speech alone cannot rebuild the strategic world of Pericles. Scholars still debate how much Athens could realistically have done to stop Macedon, but the tragedy of the moment lies partly in that uncertainty. The Athenians are not fools who simply fail to see danger. They are heirs of a political tradition facing a new form of power. At Chaeronea in 338 BCE, the question is answered on the battlefield. Athens and Thebes stand together against Philip, but the Macedonian army prevails. The defeat does not destroy Athens physically, and Philip treats the city with calculated restraint. There is no burning of the Acropolis, no erasure of the Agora, no annihilation of the citizen body. But something essential has changed. Athens is no longer fully sovereign in the old sense. Its democracy may continue in forms. Its courts may function, its festivals may be celebrated, its philosophers may teach, but the city must now operate beneath the shadow of Macedonian supremacy. The ancient experiment in citizen self-rule has not vanished, but its horizon has been lowered. Alexander, Philip's son, carries Macedonian power far beyond anything the classical polis had imagined. As he moves eastward, defeating Persia and founding cities across a vast imperial landscape, Athens becomes both smaller and larger in meaning. Smaller because it is no longer the decisive centre of power. Larger because its culture travels with Greek language, education, art, political vocabulary, and philosophical inheritance into the Hellenistic world. The paradox is sharp. Athens loses the central political independence that made its democracy so intense. Yet its intellectual influence expands across kingdoms. The city that once feared Persian conquest now watches Greek culture move into the territories of the former Persian Empire under Macedonian arms. In the late 4th century, Athens still experiences periods of renewal. The age of Lycurgus after Cheronea brings financial reform, public building, religious investment, military preparation, and a deliberate effort to strengthen civic identity. The city tends its monuments, honours its gods, organises its festivals, and preserves the memory of its dramatic tradition. Official copies of the great tragedians are made, a sign that Athens has begun to curate its own cultural past. This is a lesser-known but revealing moment. A society that once produced its masterpieces as living public performance now begins to protect them as heritage. Athens is becoming conscious of itself as Athens. The philosophical schools deepen that transformation. Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, later the Stoa and Epicurean Garden, make Athens a magnet for inquiry even when political power has moved elsewhere. Students come not because Athens commands fleets, but because it has become the place where thought has roots, the Agora. Once the beating centre of democratic argument, now exists beside more formal communities of philosophical teaching. Questions first sharpened by the pressures of the democracy continue to unfold: what is justice? What is the good life? What kind of constitution is best? How should desire be disciplined? What can human beings know? How should one live when the city is unstable? Athens no longer rules the Greek world, but it remains one of the places where the Greek world thinks about itself. Under Hellenistic kings and later under Rome, Athens becomes a city of memory, education, prestige, and symbolic capital. Roman elites visit, study, admire, imitate, collect, and sometimes misunderstand. The Parthenon survives through transformations of religion and empire. The Agora changes, new buildings appear beside old ones. The city is damaged at times, repaired at times, honoured at times, and reduced at times. What survives in the record suggests not a frozen museum, but a long, complicated afterlife. Athens becomes Christian, Byzantine, medieval, Ottoman, modern. The ancient city is buried, reused, quarried, restored, argued over and studied. Its stones pass through many worlds before becoming the ruins that modern visitors recognize. That modern recognition is itself part of the story. The Acropolis today seems timeless, but it is also the result of excavation, conservation, reconstruction, debate, and careful modern intervention. The Agora, excavated over generations, reveals that democracy was not only an idea but a lived environment of buildings, inscriptions, drains, workshops, courts, shrines, and pathways. Museums preserve fragments that once belonged to moving bodies, painted surfaces, ritual sounds, and crowded public days. The city's survival depends not only on ancient genius, but on modern labour that keeps asking what can honestly be known from broken stone. Athens endures because it refuses to become one thing. It is a model of democracy, but also a warning about exclusion, empire, demagoguery, and overconfidence. It is the birthplace of philosophical questioning, but also the city that condemned Socrates. It is a shrine of beauty, but its beauty was financed within a world of inequality and coercion. It is a symbol of freedom, but a narrow freedom by modern standards. No single explanation fully accounts for its influence because that influence comes from contradiction as much as achievement. Athens matters not because it solved the human problem of power, truth, and justice, but because it made those problems visible with unmatched intensity. The city outlived itself by becoming a question that every later age has had to answer again. The stones are quieter now. The assembly no longer gathers on the Nix to decide the fate of fleets. The triremes are gone from Piraeus. The voices of jurors, potters, generals, washerwomen, philosophers, merchants, priests, metics, enslaved workers, and farmers have dissolved into the air above Attica. Yet the hill remains. In the evening light, the Acropolis still rises above the city, not as it was, but as memory has allowed it to remain damaged, repaired, incomplete, and strangely alive. Athens teaches that human greatness is never clean. It grows from need, fear, hunger, ambition, imagination, argument, and the desire to be remembered. A poor land turns people toward the sea. A crisis over debt opens the way to reform. A tyranny prepares public space for a democracy. A democracy creates freedom for some while denying it to others. A city saves Greece from Persia, then becomes an empire over Greeks. A place of philosophy executes a philosopher. A defeated city becomes one of the most influential teachers in history. Across the centuries, what lingers is not only marble, it is the sound of a question. How should people govern themselves when power is necessary and dangerous? How can speech reveal truth when speech can also mislead? How can freedom survive wealth, fear, war, pride, and the hunger to dominate Athens gives no final answer. It gives a record of attempts, failures, recoveries, and brilliance bright enough to cast shadows. And perhaps that is why the city still holds the imagination. Not because it was perfect, but because it was human on a monumental scale. Its democracy was fragile. Its wisdom was incomplete. Its beauty was built by hands whose names mostly disappeared. But for a brief span of history, on a rocky peninsula between thin soil and shining sea, one city dared to make public life an argument about the meaning of being human. The light fades over the old stones. The sea beyond Attica darkens. The olive trees hold their silver leaves in the wind, and Athens, no longer ruling, still asks its questions.